All right, good morning. Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here and finding your way up to the 6th floor. I know it was a bit hard to find. And welcome to the first workshop on neural fields beyond conventional cameras. We're really excited to have you here and to go through today's program. My name is Sophie. I'm one of the organizers for the workshop, and I'm here representing 7 other amazing organizers who've worked really hard to put together the program that we have for today. So we kind of came together, I guess, around 9 months ago with a shared interest in how neural fields could kind of go beyond, quote unquote, conventional cameras, whether it be beyond kind of standard cues and into modeling things like shadows and reflections, polarization, and so on. Other modalities like ultrasounds, cryo-EM, and X-ray, so on, things you'll hear more about today. So we're really excited to have you all as we kind of learn together today how we can move this field forward. So today I'll pull up the agenda. We'll have 5 keynote speakers, including Daniel Cremers, David Lindell, Jon Barron, Carl Vondrick, and Tali Treibitz. We'll also have a expert panel discussion at the end of the workshop, moderated by Or Litany, and including David Lindell, Jon Barron, and Tali Treibitz. And then in addition, we had a call for papers and had a great response. So we'll have 22 posters with students' work during the poster session, which will be held during the coffee break today. So I hope you make it to that. And then out of those 22 posters, 3 were selected for spotlight presentation. So we'll have 10-minute presentations from each of those 3 papers. And so please also know we do have a virtual attendance today. So welcome to everyone who's also attending over Zoom. Yeah, we'll have the Zoom open during the workshop, and the workshop is also being recorded to make it accessible to those who are not able to make it today. So it should be a fun morning. Thanks again for being here. And with that being said, I'll introduce one of my co-organizers, Kushagra Tiwari, to introduce our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Coach. Our first speaker is Daniel Cremers. Over here speaking over your laptop. So Daniel is a professor at TUM, the Technical University of Munich. Computer vision and artificial intelligence. His publications received several awards, including Best Paper of the Year 2003, the Olympus Award 2004, now called the German Patent Recognition Award, in 2005, UCLA Chancellor Award for postdoctoral research. He also received the starting grant, 2 proof of concept grants, a consolidated grant and advanced grant by the European Research Council. And in December 2010, he's also listed Germany's top 40 researchers below 40 and received the biggest award in German academia as well.
Okay. So first of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. This is, in fact, the very first time that I talk about this work, that I talk about event cameras in the first place. Like just 5 days ago, I contacted Or and I said, what do you want me to talk about? Beyond conventional cameras is not what we usually do. And then he said, well, you did this line of work on event cameras. And then I thought, oh, yeah, okay, yeah. And in fact, so it's the first time I talk about event cameras, but turns out we have worked on event cameras for over 10 years. It's just I haven't ever talked about it. This is work that was done by a number of current and former students of mine, in particular, Simon, Marvin, Lucas, Felix, Nan, and as external collaborator, David Scaramuzza. Many of you know me and know that I usually talk about, SLAM, visual SLAM from standard cameras. So for example, this is one of the works that we did, the follow-up to LSD SLAM, technique called direct sparse odometry, which allows to track cameras, standard monocular cameras, as you can see here from a single video of someone going into a subway station, going back out on the other side. You can see we can very robustly and precisely track the camera and map the 3D world. And so there's a lot of potential for 3D computing in cameras. And one of the things we'll explore in this presentation today is the use of event cameras for these kinds of purposes. The other thing that I will touch on is neural networks. I also don't talk so much about neural networks, but we did look into, you know, how can we deploy neural networks for enhancing SLAM. So we showed that you can, you know, this is something a lot of people have done to predict depth maps from single images. And that works fairly well in say, a known environment like the self-driving setting. So we showed that this was a paper in 2018. We built up on this network by Kuznetsov and collaborators and showed you can generate depth predictions with a network that are actually very precise. And then you can feed these depth predictions into the SLAM pipeline. So you end up with techniques that are essentially hybrid between classical optimization techniques and learning-based techniques. And so we show that you can predict many things. You can have networks given 2 consecutive frames from the video. You can predict for each frame the depths, as you saw. You can predict the relative camera motion between the 2 frames. And you can predict the notion of uncertainty that will tell you which points in the image are likely to be photoconsistent over time. And that way you can downweight areas that are likely not photoconsistent on metallic structures and glass and, you know, moving trees, etc. And once you feed all of these predictions into the SLAM pipeline, you get something that, at least at the time of publication, had completely unprecedented precision. What you see here is trajectories and maps generated from just one single camera in a car. So no stereo, no IMU, no multi-view, just one single camera filming. And as you can see, compared to just standard monocular DSO, this deep learning enhanced one is much more precise, and it also gives you the scale of the world. And obviously, while you're at it, once you have deep networks, you see they predict dense depth maps. So you can actually create dense worlds by fusing all these predictions into say a 3D point cloud or mesh, or if you prefer NeRFs, obviously you can use that as well to then encode the world. That said, you know, to train a NeRF, you typically need a lot of images from a lot of views. So this here is a point cloud, is something that's fairly compactly represented in the computer and that can serve for driver assistance and things like that. I think the main kind of observation from this work is that potentially for capturing the 3D world for self-driving, we may not need LiDARs because the camera gives you this just one camera, right? Obviously, if you have more sensors, IMUs, stereo, you would use these. Then this is work by Felix Wimbauer. This one was the next one as well. And here the idea is, can we go beyond depth prediction? Can we actually predict full-blown 3D from one image? A classical challenge in vision, single image 3D prediction. And it turns out we can, and this is how we propose to tackle it. And this is somehow taking it a little bit into the direction of neural radiance fields. So what we do here is different from neural radiance fields, but you'll see there is a relation. We predict density. We don't predict radiance, but just neural radiance, but we predict the density across each ray here, right? So basically, but we do that from a camera perspective. So for the current frame, we want to predict the density along each ray. That means we not only predict the depths in the sense of when is the first point that we're going to hit, but also where does the object end and where does the next object start. Now you'd say we don't actually see that. Indeed, that's why we call this work behind the scenes. But you can use later data from a video and train this in a self-supervised way to actually predict the full-blown density. And density is just a scalar, so we don't have like the color. We don't predict the color like in NeRF, you'd predict the color as well in addition to the density. We find if you just predict the density, you have a much smaller prediction, and this is much more easily trained than a NeRF. And so we can train it easily. We can get away with a much smaller MLP as well to do this. And this, as a result, this easily runs at 10 frames a second. And there's one fundamental difference to NeRFs. NeRFs, they don't generalize. You train for a specific scene. I guess many of you work on NeRFs. So you can train it for one scene, but once you have a new scene, there's nothing that it learns from the past and applies in the future. This is different here. Once we train this network, we can apply it to completely unseen imagery, and it generates full-blown 3D. In fact, the density, and then we threshold this density to get what you see here. And so these are 3D reconstructions obtained from single images. It doesn't even use the video, right? It's just frame by frame. We compare here to other approaches, in particular depth prediction. And you see depth prediction gives you the first part of the object, but it doesn't tell you where things end. Whereas here you can see the network has some idea of how big cars are, and it can, even without seeing them, it can sort of look behind the scenes in a way that humans, I think, also do when they process the world. And much like in NeRFs, you can do novel view synthesis. At least to some extent, you can show that you can. What we don't capture is lighting effects. That's because we don't, it's not a full-blown radiance field. So we don't capture this view dependency. The colors, we actually just read them out from the input frame. So there is no modeling of the lighting variations or the specularities in glass and things like that. So now, but this is still conventional cameras. So let's come to beyond conventional cameras. And what we looked at are event cameras. These have many names in the community. Sometimes they're called neuromorphic cameras. I think there was a workshop on neuromorphic vision yesterday, same place here. Sometimes they're called dynamic vision sensors. I think the first one was called dynamic vision sensor from the INI labs from ETH. In fact, Lichtensteiner, Posch, and Delbrück are the three researchers who pioneered this. Sometimes they're also called silicon retina. So there's different names for them. And they are a little bit mimicked based on the human eye. And the key idea is that, and I think that's quite clever, if you look at cameras, right, very often nothing happens in the world. And then the camera will constantly give you the brightness of that pixel, even though it never changed, right? So a lot of information that is transmitted that is not very informative, since nothing actually happens. It's like you ask every pixel, is anything happen? And at 30 frames a second, they'll tell you same color, same color, same color, and you don't really want to know, right? You want to have pixels that only tell you if actually something changes, right? And so you have a much more efficient kind of information throughput. And this is the idea of these neuromorphic sensors, these event cameras, as they're now often called. And the best is seen here. This is an example that a lot of researchers in this field use, this idea of, a disk with a black dot that is rotating around. And so what happens is if this disk rotates at a normal kind of speed, then what you get is every time the brightness changes, either it gets darker or brighter beyond a certain threshold, then this will spark an event at the respective pixel. And so if this is the pixel, then this is time, you get a continuous stream of events. And what's important is it's really continuous. So you are not limited to the typical frame rate of a classical camera, because you can basically use the fact that you're not transmitting anything for the other pixels, and so get an extremely high temporal resolution. In principle, unlimited temporal resolution. And then if there's no motion, let's say because the disk stands still, then there are no events, no information, nothing, and that basically tells you nothing is happening. And then if the disk rotates faster, then you get, the spirals faster, obviously, right? What's interesting is what happens, and you see it in this visualization, what happens in standard cameras is, first of all, you're limited to a certain frame rate. And so for robotics applications, that limits how fast you can react to certain things. If you want to, like my collaborator, Davide Scaramuzza, he's gotten a lot into drone racing, and you need very fast response, right? And with standard cameras, at least the camera itself only tells you something every 30 times a second. So it's it's limited there. The other issue with standard cameras, you see it here, is once things move faster, you get motion blur, right? Something we all know. And this is a notorious issue. Also, if you want to capture nerves from moving cameras, you might get blur into the camera that will dramatically degrade your reconstructions. There are, approaches like Ultra-NeRF that compensate with that for that, but you'll see this only works so. So here's this, you can visualize it in form of the video, so here's the rotating dot, and you see how the events are streaming in. And on the top, you have the conventional camera, and on the bottom, this event sensor. What are the advantages of this event sensor? Well, the first one is that you have this extreme temporal resolution, arbitrary high temporal resolution, essentially. I guess, if you go into details, you would find some physical limit, but in principle, it's very high. Then you have high dynamic range is something we observe. So these sensors work really well in low light conditions in the dark. We'll see examples in a bit. And then low latency, so you have very fast response times, and also low power consumption, which makes them well suited for a lot of embedded systems, drones, things like that, where you don't want power hungry solutions. So obviously there is a potential in these cameras, and people in the computer vision community have been looking into this for 3D computer vision. And so I did some studies and looked into who actually were some of the first people to do this. And turns out we were, I believe, the first work that did event-based 6 degree of freedom SLAM. 3D SLAM, yeah. So this is ICRA 2014, a work of one of my students, David Weikersdorfer. Now, how did we get into that? It's a very easy explanation. Jörg Conrad, our collaborator here, he came from Zurich, from the INI labs, and he brought one of these event sensors along. And I was doing SLAM at the time, so if you get an event sensor guy and a SLAM guy together, well, you'll get event SLAM, right? What do you expect? So here's the system that we advocated. It's a system that combines an event sensor on the top with a depth sensing camera. And this is actually a notorious thing with event-based SLAM, that very often people add additional sensors because the pure event-based SLAM seems to be difficult. And so we did that as well. We suggested to combine it. And I must say, I discussed it a lot with David at the time. I said, do we really need the big, depth camera there? Because in a way, the issue with that is, we showed you can do nice SLAM. We showed that the event sensor significantly improves the performance, right? But in a way, once you have a traditional camera somehow connected, you invariably inherit all the downsides or some of the downsides of the traditional sensor, in particular that the image only comes 30 frames a second, or the depth map, right? Obviously, the events come at a higher rate, so to speak, but in a way, this is, it's not as elegant. It would be better to have a pure event-based SLAM. And so this was 2014, 10 years ago. There's a number of people like Davidis Karamutsa, Andy Davison, Han-Mi Kim, many others who entered this game a few years after. This is EVO, for example, Event Visual Odometry. Then Ultimate SLAM is a follow-up work. And this, as you can see in the title, it combines events, images, and IMU. And why does it combine it? Because the pure event-based just didn't work so well. Let's put it that way. And this is actually true here. You see as well a robust monocular event-based visual inertial. So there is an IMU as well that they added. Same here. Stereo visual inertial, right? So, a lot of additional sensors come to the game because pure event was not really working. And this is what we find in the literature review, even after 10 years after we started in this game, to date, the powerful visual odometry and SLAM methods, they make use of additional sensory information to somehow compensate. And you might say, why is that? Well, the issue is that the event sensor is just so very different from a standard camera. You cannot use the usual computer vision techniques. Convolutional networks, for one thing, were designed to work on frames, on images. These are not images. These are individual events that come, and so they're much more unstructured. And so one has to completely revisit a little bit how to tackle things. And we'll see that for SLAM and for neural radiance field estimation as well. But once you add additional sensors, it makes the systems more complex, more costly, more heavy, more big. It's not as low power, it's not as lightweight, and it doesn't, then all the advantages of being robust to motion blur. Well, once you have a frame camera, it suffers from motion blur if you add it, right? And then the whole system suffers from that motion blur, and also the high dynamic range. The frame that you have is prone to issues with overexposure, underexposure, right? And so it would be much more elegant to have a purely event-based system. And so this is what we set out to do now, 10 years after starting the game. We asked ourselves, can we achieve high precision monocular event-only visual odometry? And it turns out we can. And this is the approach. It's a technique that we call DEVO, for deep event visual odometry. And this was published earlier this year at 3DV. What we do there is we do a supervised training of a neural network using both the poses of the camera, so ground truth poses, and the inverse steps. And with that, we can determine, this basically entails a certain flow, an optical flow that you can get from poses and inverse steps. And then we can try to predict that flow from event patches. And the key idea is that this DEVO system sparsely tracks selected event patches over time. And as you can see here, we create this event grid, and then we have a module in the network that is a patch selector trained to identify which patches in this event grid are well suited for tracking. And then this all feeds into an estimation pipeline where a recurrent operator refines the flow estimates, poses and depths using differentiable bundle adjustment. And this then is fed back into a loss function that assures, as you can see, consistency with respect to the ground truth pose, consistency with respect to the inverse depths, and as you see here, consistency with respect to the flow. And so this is, in some sense, the key intuition that drove us here is that from the events, you should be able to predict which direction things move. And if we can actually have a loss function that makes sure that the flow predictions are consistent with the ground truth flow that we get from poses and inverse steps, we have a very powerful signal to train the network. And so we can use this to track patches and to estimate then camera motion here with the poses. So now, how do we evaluate this? There are a number of data sets out there. We figured they're not enough. In particular, many data sets only have some information. They only have events, and frames, but maybe no IMU information. And we said, let's get a data set that has everything. So, this is even more bulky than combining event and RGBD camera like we did 10 years ago. Yeah, it's not the kind of helmet I would want to wear when riding my bicycle. But the guys took it on the bicycle. Yeah, We're paid by the ERC and they want to see high risk research. So we do these kinds of things. And so here's an example, in fact, from bike riding at night. And here you see, you know, the standard frames, left and right camera frame, and you see there's very bad visibility. Here are the corresponding left and right event cameras. So we have stereo vision, stereo event, and inertial information. It's a data set we call the TUM-VIE data set, and it has all this data. And you see here, this I find interesting, what I said earlier, this high dynamic range that you have. So you can see structures here in the event stream that you don't see in the color image because of under or overexposure, because it's not a high dynamic range camera. So here's the data set. This is just examples of the different motions, the camera images, the event stream, here going through the hallway. So we do a lot of different things that people want us to do, obviously. And you can imagine what comes next, obviously, is we also do the slides. We have these big slides in our building. And obviously, whenever we do evaluations, we check, does it work in the slides? It's important, you know, because not for you, you don't have slides in your building, but if you want to go around in our building, you need to be able to track yourselves through the slides. Here they are. And here you see it both in the vision and the event stream, right? So this is a way that allows us to assess the performance on these kinds of data sets, but there are other data sets, and it's important that things work on you know, any data set ideally. And so here's some evaluations of this approach, deep event visual odometry, DEVO. And so what you see here is different sequences from, you know, I think this may be our data set, but there's other sequences. No, this is not our data set. Maybe Zurich. I don't know. I guess some of you might. Okay, I should rush. Yeah, so you see the ground truth and the event camera. Here is another example. You see how precisely it tracks the camera, the ground truth, and the event tracking really follow each other very closely. This is just showing the comparison to the ground truth. At the end of each sequence, we also show, you know, competing approaches, the state-of-the-art competitors, and you will see that none of them track as precisely as this one. And here again, fast motion that typically kills visual odometry. Here in a pure event odometry, it is extremely robust to very fast motions. So here you see the competing approaches, and some of them do not work very well, like the PLEVIO or ESVIO. There's more videos. I think I'll skip the videos for time reasons, but it really works nicely across many different data sets. Here is one evaluation on the Hong Kong data set, and it shows that this method, DEVO, really outperforms all other approaches, including approaches that use inertial, that use stereo, etc. So it is really, here's kind of an exhaustive evaluation across 7 data sets, where basically what we show, here's the 7 data sets, and this is always showing where is our method the #1 performer. And on all data sets, on pretty much all sequences, it is the #1, even though it's a pure event approach, and some of the others use more sensory data. And sometimes it's not #1 necessarily, but maybe the second best. This was actually the radiance fields. Let me make that really quick because the topic is on radiance fields. We also propose a technique that we call ECCV, neural radiance fields from moving cameras. And the idea is you train a radiance field, much like NeRF, but what you train is you don't train with the color signal as a loss function, but you train with the event stream as a loss function, because what the sensor measures are events. And so there is an additional complexity. You have this logarithmic brightness of a certain pixel, and once it exceeds a threshold, it kicks off a threshold C, it kicks off an event. And then we can, for pairs of arrays, we can basically create this discrepancy and say it should coincide with the events that we observe. And so you model the radiance along each ray, you integrate with volume rendering along each ray, but then the loss is not the brightness at each pixel, but this discrepancy that gives rise to the events. And so this loss on the event stream is what drives everything. And then you can use a standard color camera. You have frames with very fast motion that are extremely motion blurred. And then even de-blur NeRF approaches like that do not work, whereas this E-NeRF approach, if you just use the event stream, it gives you a gray value reconstruction because there is no color in the event stream. But if you combine it with blurred input frames, then you get a nice colored reconstruction. And as you can see, it's very crisp and colored and sharp and much better than trying to model the blur. And here's quantitative evaluations over, torch, NGP, de-blur NeRF, many approaches, and we find that it consistently outperforms in terms of the quantitative performance. And here's examples with compared to torch and other approaches, and you see we get much more sharp and crisp reconstructions of the texture. Like here on the right, you can hardly see that there's anything written on this paper, whereas here you see the writing. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.
I think we've run out of time for questions, but I would urge everyone to find Daniel, ECCV.
So thanks again, Daniel, for this inspiring talk. I'm glad to introduce our second speaker, David Lindell. David is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, a faculty affiliate at the Vector Institute, and founding member of the Toronto Computational Imaging Group. His work is at the intersection of machine learning, computational imaging, and computer vision. Along these lines, he's worked on next-generation computational imaging systems for imaging around corners and scattering media, and new machine learning algorithms for representing and processing signals. His work is relevant to a broad range of applications in computer graphics, vision, and remote sensing.
Great, thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to talk today about our work on novel view synthesis, visualizing propagating light. This is work led by my PhD student, Anik Malik, in collaboration with Noah Jurafsky, Ryan Poe, Gordon Wetstein, and Kyros Koutoulakos. Okay, so I want to take you back to a thought experiment that this is Albert Einstein's famous thought experiment, where he imagines that there's an observer standing on a train platform. The train is passing by, and at the precise instant that a passenger carriage passes him, two bolts of lightning come down, and they strike one side of the passenger carriage and the other side, and the observer is right at the midpoint between these two lightning bolts. Now, the observer will see these two bolts of lightning strike simultaneously. And then Einstein asked the question, what if there's another observer riding with the passenger car? What does this person see? Well, our observer on the train platform will see the two wavefronts of light from the two lightning bolts propagating towards him at the speed of light. And since he's at the midway point, he'll see them appear, those two bolts of lightning will appear to have struck simultaneously. And what about our observer on the passenger car? Well, he's moving towards one wavefront of light. And if he's moving very quickly, then he will close to that wavefront faster than the other wavefront. And because the path lengths become shorter, to that observer, it will appear that the wavefront in the direction of the motion of the train struck first. So how we perceive light transport depends on where we are and how we're moving. So it would appear to him that the right event happened first. So in this work and in this talk today, I want to ask two questions. The first is, can we capture and visualize light propagation from moving viewpoints? And the second is, can we observe viewpoint-dependent changes in light propagation as Einstein predicted in his thought experiment? So to answer these questions, I want to show you this result that we captured. This is what we call a transient video. This is an ultra-fast video of light propagation. And in this scene, we've hooked up a pulsed laser. It's coupled into a fiber optic cable and then coupled out into free space through a collimator. And it sends pulses of light through this Coca-Cola bottle millions of times every second. And then we use a single photon avalanche diode, or a SPAD, to capture this scene at 250 billion frames per second. And that's fast enough to see the motion of light propagating through the scene. And similar to Einstein's thought experiment, I want to ask you to think in your own minds, well, what will happen? What will we see in this scene, in this video of light propagation? As light propagates through the bottle and scatters out, will we see light appear to our camera that's moving in front of this Coca-Cola bottle? Will we see light reach the far corner of this ground plane? Or will we observe light reaching the near corner first? Okay, so let's watch and see what happens. Okay, so the pulse of light is emitted. You can see it here. And some of the light scatters out, refracts out from the bottle onto the ground plane. As the light propagates through, it focuses at the cap of the bottle. And here's the answer to my question. We see the light hit the ground plane nearest to the camera first, and then the light appears to propagate away from the camera to the far point on the ground plane before scattering back to the other side of the bottle. I'll just play that once more so you can see it all together. So why do we see light appear to reach the near point on the ground plane first? Well, simply because the path length that light needs to travel from the Coca-Cola bottle to that point on the ground plane to the camera is shorter than the path to the far point of the ground plane into the camera. And so again, just like Einstein predicted, light transport is viewpoint or reference frame dependent. So the answer to both of these questions is yes and no. So first of all, we can't move at relativistic speeds. So some of the effects that Einstein predicted, we won't see. So in fact, you would think that for an observer moving at, say, 0.3 times the speed of light, 0.3 c, towards an event, in this case, towards that wavefront of light that's traveling towards him at 1 times the speed of light, you would think that that wavefront would appear to be closing to him at 1.3 times the speed of light, just the sum of the velocities, right? Well, actually, the universe doesn't work that way. In any reference frame, the speed of light is constant. So that observer sees light close to him, sees the wavefront close to him at the speed of light, and yet he will reach that wavefront sooner. So how does this work? Well, it turns out that space-time actually contracts. Yeah.
Can you determine the position of the ray in 3D?
That's coming. Yeah. So I'll show you how we generate this result in just a bit. Yeah, it's a good question though. So just to finish this point, the speed of light is constant in every reference frame. So as we start to move at relativistic speeds, space-time actually contracts to preserve the speed of light. And this is a relativistic effect called Lorentz contraction. So we can't actually visualize these effects because we can't move at speeds very close to the speed of light. But what we can do is visualize propagation of light, including viewpoint-dependent effects that depend on path lengths. And I'll get to how we do this in 3D in just a bit. Now, I first want to mention that there's a relatively long history of ultra-fast or transient imaging using different types of sensors. For example, street cameras, time-of-flight cameras, interferometric techniques, or SPADs. But these have primarily been limited to single viewpoint capture. And in this work, we're capturing a scene from multiple viewpoints. And here's the connection to the workshop today. We're using neural fields to do a NeRF type reconstruction to show visualizations like the one I just displayed for you. So our work is connected in that way to NeRFs and video novel view synthesis. But as I showed you, light transport is viewpoint dependent. So we cannot directly apply these techniques that don't account for the finite speed of light. And we also build on some of our previous work, in particular transient NeRF, which was also performing novel view synthesis of propagating light, but only the direct component, like that goes to a point and scatters directly back to the camera, where in this work, we're actually capturing and modeling much more sophisticated light transport effects, such as scattering and refraction, and so on. So the main contributions here are our method for novel view synthesis of videos of light propagation, as well as a new neural field parameterization to make this possible. And we capture a new multi-viewpoint transient video data set to showcase showcase and evaluate this method. All right, so how does this work? So I mentioned that we're using a single photon avalanche diode. In particular, we use a single pixel device that images the scene through a pair of scanning mirrors. So we use this set of scanning mirrors to image each point in the scene, and we synchronize this device with a picosecond pulsed laser. This laser sends out millions of pulses of light into the scene every second, and for every pulse that goes out, our SPAD has a chance at detecting and timestamping a single photon. We repeat that measurement over and over and over again for every scan point, and we build up this measurement of what's called a transient, or an ultra-fast measurement of the time-varying intensity of light at picosecond timescales. This is essentially a histogram of photon counts arriving to the sensor at very fast timescales. And we can capture one of these transient measurements at every scan point and build up then a video of light propagation at that viewpoint. And then we repeat this measurement, the set of measurements, multiple times for multiple viewpoints. And this results in a data set, a collection of transient videos, each captured for a single viewpoint. And so this is what we would capture. This is shown for a simulated scene. And I'll just highlight and zoom in on two videos here to show you something interesting that happens. So this is the same scene, the same point source of light is illuminating the scene. You can see the wavefronts propagating through the scene. But what we see here is that on the left viewpoint, light is propagating or appears to propagate down and to the left, whereas in the right viewpoint, light propagates straight down this back wall. So why do we see the differences in light propagation? This just goes back to the thought experiment I told you about in the beginning. And this, again, so the difference is because it takes light different amounts of time to propagate to each point in the scene and to the camera. So light transport is viewpoint dependent because of the changes in path lengths, okay? And this is exactly why we can't just take a video NeRF and apply it off the shelf. So instead, what we do, we build on neural radiance field techniques, and we render a scene by casting a ray from a camera, from the camera center of projection into the scene, and we sample points along those rays, and we use a neural field representation to map from a 3D point and viewing direction to a density parameter. And instead of predicting an RGB color or radiance value, we predict a per sample transient. So at every sample along the ray, we predict a one-dimensional time-resolved waveform, as shown here. And then we can model the light propagation delays by calculating the distance from our camera center of projection to the sample point, and then simply shifting the rendered one-dimensional transient predicted by our network by that corresponding propagation delay. And then to render the final transient for a particular camera array, we simply volume render these samples together. And then the whole representation is supervised by minimizing the difference between what we capture and what we render from the representation. And in this way, we can, after the representation is trained, we can render transient videos of propagating light from different camera positions by rendering the transient in this fashion, sampling a particular time instant, moving the camera to a new location, sampling the next instant in time for that corresponding rendered transient, and so on. And that's how we render these videos. So we actually capture these measurements in practice by building a hardware prototype that you see here. There's a scene on that we position on a rotation stage. We hook up the pulsed laser, we fiber couple it into this collimator. Sometimes we put a diffuser in front of the light source to emulate a point source of light. And then our camera, which again is the SPAD and some scanning mirrors, is positioned on this elevation stage so that the whole capture setup looks something like this. This is a time lapse. So actually these measurements, these videos take quite a long time to capture. It takes about 20 minutes per viewpoint to collect enough photons to form a clean video. And at from every viewpoint, we pause the scene, capture the video, rotate the gantry to the next position, and so on. Okay, so let me show you some captured results, some more captured results now. Or actually, first I'll start off with some simulated results. So here's a scene where we've simulated a point source of light, wavefronts coming from that light source down the wall. We have some objects in the scene, in particular a glass ball that showcases some refractive light transport. And then we also see some secondary reflections from indirect light. And I'm going to visualize this result and other results I show you by compositing the transient video on top of an integrated intensity image, just so that you can better see what's happening in the scene. And we can compare our approach to a few different techniques. So first we can compare to transient NeRF on the left. This is a technique that only renders direct components of light transport. So what you won't see is indirect second bounces of light for this method. We can also compare to video NeRF methods, in particular K-planes in the middle. And this method doesn't account for the viewpoint dependence of light transport. So what you'll see is artifacts that occur in the rendering because we're not accounting for propagation delays of light. And then finally on the right is the proposed method that accounts for these viewpoint dependent changes and can model indirect reflections of light. Okay, so let's show some captured results. This is a scene shown on the left where we have a mirror, a statue, some other objects in the scene, and we're illuminating it with a point source of light. So in the video on the right, you see this wavefront propagating through the scene. I'll pause it here. You see, now pay attention to the wavefront on the left. This wavefront will appear to be frozen as the camera is moving because the camera is moving with the wavefront of light. And then I'll just note here too that the light appears to reach the statue first and then watch for the reflection in the mirror and when that lights up. The wavefront starts moving again based on the camera motion, and then a few nanoseconds later, we see, maybe half a nanosecond later, we see the reflection appear in the mirror because it takes light longer to propagate to the mirror and then back to the camera than to the objects themselves. Okay. Here's another scene that we captured where we submerged a mirror and a diffuse reflector in a tank of water, and we put a little bit of milk in the water so that it would scatter out the light. And then this scene we're illuminating with pulses of light. So you'll see pulse of light enter the water, propagate to the mirror. We see a specular reflection off the mirror, and I'll pause it here. Notice that the brightness of the pulse appears to change depending on where the camera is. Why is that? Well, this is just a function of how light scatters through this particular turbid medium. Water with a bit of milk in it turns out to be primarily forward scattering. Most of the light scatters in the forward direction. A lot less of the light is scattered in the backward direction. So as you move the camera behind the pulse of light, it appears to get dimmer. And then we see diffuse reflection at the end here. Okay, one more scene I want to show. In the water tank, we put a diffraction grating in the path of the light. So here, as the pulse propagates through the diffraction grating, it splits into the 0th, 1st, 2nd, and higher order modes. And you can see that happen in a time resolved fashion. Okay, I'll just show one more. This is a scene where we have a statue and then some candles. And the interesting thing about candles is that their appearance is dominated not by light that reflects off the surface, but by light that enters into the candle scatters around for a while, and then leaks out over time. And we can see that happen in the video that we capture. Wavefront of light propagates through the scene. You see a component of direct reflection off the candle, and then it stays lit up for a while. And that's exactly this light that's bouncing around and leaking out over time. And then we also see some secondary reflections of light ringing around, bouncing around in the scene after that. Okay, another cool thing we can do with this technique is to retime light transport. So we are borrowing or extending a technique from Velton et al. Called time warping, which allows us to change how we visualize light propagation. Here, remember, in this Coca-Cola bottle video, what we see depends partly on the path length of light from each point, each surface in the scene to the camera. That distance from the camera to the surface changes how the scene looks, makes light transport viewpoint dependent. We can re-render the scene by removing that delay from the camera to the surface, which makes this visualization, removes the viewpoint dependency, and makes things a bit more intuitive to see. So if you can see this, the light appears now to propagate down from the Coke bottle and hit both of these corners on the ground plane simultaneously. So because we've captured all this data and we have control over how we render it, we can change how we visualize light transport in these scenes. Okay. So just a few final comments about this. I told you at the beginning that we can visualize some parts of light transport in this case, but what we can't see are relativistic effects. I told you about Lorentz contraction, the fact that when you start to move at the speed of light, space-time in the direction of travel starts to constrict. There are other relativistic effects as well. Actually, light starts to become blue shifted as you move towards it at relativistic speeds. And there are other relativistic effects as well. We discuss these in the paper and show some renderings of these by incorporating rendering of relativistic effects into our framework. But you could probably do more there and visualize these techniques, more of these relativistic techniques in our framework. And we've primarily focused on visualization in what I've showed you today, but we're now working on using these types of multi-viewpoint, transient or ultra-fast videos of light propagation to solve inverse problems. You can imagine that these videos provide actually a very rich signal about what's happening in the scene. You could use multiply scattered light to recover 3D geometry, to infer material properties, to see through scattering media, to see around corners and behind occluders, and so on. So I think mining the information in these videos could be very interesting to solve what are conventionally very challenging inverse problems. And it would also be interesting to use these techniques in more of an artistic fashion to showcase and inform what light transport and what light propagation looks like. Perhaps there are other interesting effects that we could capture, nonlinear optical effects, or maybe even quantum effects. And we've also been working on new techniques that not only capture what happens in a scene at very fast timescales, but can simultaneously capture what scenes look like across a whole range of timescales. We call this ultra-wideband imaging. I'll just show one result from that as well. So this is a scene that we captured that has a fan that's spinning, and there's a wavefront of light from a laser, a pulse of light that propagates across the scene from left to right. We can capture the scene once using SPADs, and then we can actually play back this scene at any timescale we wish. So at a rate of a few hundred hertz or kilohertz, we see the fan blades start to spin. As we push up into the millions of frames per second, we start to see the pulses of light from the laser. And then at billions of frames per second, we can actually resolve the wavefront. At 250 billion frames per second, light slows to a crawl. We can see the blades of the fan frozen in position, and the wavefront move off the scene. So it could be interesting to exploit techniques like this to visualize and reconstruct the world in 3D. Okay. So that's it. I'd also like to once again recognize collaborators and funding agencies that were part of this work. Anug is here maybe today. Yeah, there's Anug over there. So we'll be showing a poster in the poster session at the workshop. And you can also come see us in the oral session tomorrow and at poster number 246 in the morning. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, David, for this very cool work. Anyone wants to ask a question?
Are there ambiguities in the transients you reconstruct? Nice. You don't have enough views, so there's many transients.
Yeah, are there ambiguities in the transients we reconstruct? So yeah, one thing about this work is we're using a fairly dense set of captured views. If you move to capturing sparser views and you don't use some additional form of regularization, there are a number of works that perform sparse view reconstruction, in particular for NeRF. If you don't use any of those techniques, then you're not going to get nice looking video novel view synthesis. That's in general and also for this work. Yeah, good question.
Any other questions?
For clarification, so the transient is view dependent, is that right?
That's right. The transient is view dependent.
And those histograms that become the new RGB property of the neural field, do they follow some structure? Do you have to somehow regularize them or represent them in some? I mean, is there like a good way to represent them to make the reconstruction better?
Yeah. So about the representation. So we predict actually discretely sampled 1D. We basically predict a vector. The network outputs a vector for every transient. It's pretty memory intensive. There's probably a better way to do this. You could imagine using a more memory efficient representation that predicts coefficients of a basis function that would then parameterize the time resolved waveform. That would save memory and that would perhaps regularize the problem. So this is something that we've been thinking about and working on as well. But yeah, it's a good question.
Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thanks again, David. Now we'll welcome up Xinhang Liu, who'll talk about CryoFormers, continuous heterogeneous cryo-EM reconstructions using transformer-based neural representations.
Typically, our focus is on modeling protein dynamics. So these dynamics are essential for proteins to perform their biological functions, and accurate modeling of them can significantly advance research in areas such as drug design and protein folding. And there have been several mainstream methods for determining protein structures, and among them, X-ray crystallography can only handle static homogeneous structure, and NMR is only suitable for small proteins, while cryo-EM stands out as the only method capable of handling large heterogeneous protein structures, which means these structures can have dynamics and have motions. So this makes it significant in the field of structural biology. So in a cryo-EM experiment, we start by freezing a solution of proteins in a thin layer of ice. Then an electron gun generates a beam interacting with the sample. And during this process, scattered electrons are captured by this detector. And this produces a 2D projection image. So it normally contains hundreds of thousands of particles of the target proteins. And so the conventional cryo-EM reconstruction pipeline first pick particles from the 2D images like this, and these 2D particle micrographs are then classified and curated for further processing. So the following 3D reconstruction involves simultaneously simulating the poses of all these micrographs, as well as the 3D biological structures. So this can be actually related to 3D reconstruction from images taken by conventional cameras, where the input is images and output is camera poses and 3D geometry. And in our case of cryo-EM imaging, The input are picked particles, and the output is also their poses along with the 3D density volume. And of course, the principles to solve these problems are different. For conventional cameras, our CV community solves it using triangulation, while cryo-EM reconstruction relies on the central slicing theorem, performing the reconstruction in the Fourier domain. And now let's further compare the reconstruction between conventional cameras and cryo-EM images, but in the dynamic setting. So in our SIGGRAPH 2021 work, we reconstructed a 4D scene using videos captured from a camera array, and the result is 3-point video like this, like the one you see here. So in cryo-EM heterogeneous reconstruction, we also aim to determine a dynamic structure. However, unlike the left setting, we don't have calibrated camera poses. So the poses of each micrograph need to be determined. And we also don't have a known time order. This meaning that we don't have explicit time step for each of these micrographs. And furthermore, the images we work with are extremely noisy, makes it even harder to do the reconstruction. And the point of this work is to also utilize neural field representation like this to handle the cryo-EM setting. And so in 2021, Alan Zhong proposed 2 model structures using neural fields, and this work is known as CryoDragon. So this approach extracts a conformational embedding from the input image, and conditioned on this embedding, it then uses an MLP to map 3D coordinates to density values. And this allows for continuous modeling of dynamic structures. So this is different than conventional method, which only discretize all the conformations, and that's discrete. We don't have a continuous modeling of the dynamics. However, this CryoDragon work utilize neural field in the Fourier space. This is because we need to leverage the central slice theorem, and that naturally happens in the Fourier domain. But this can be suboptimal in with neural field. Here is our observation. So here we show a structure with 2 states here with a small motion between them, and this is the image of real domain. And you can see a very small. You can see when we transfer to Fourier domain, a very small motion can actually be there's very large variations, and we find that neural fields are not able to easily model such variations, which leads to the loss of high frequency signals. Therefore, we propose a method called CryoFormer, which is a real domain neural representation. And we found that building a neural field in the real domain can benefit our reconstruction resolution. And beyond that, we enhance our neural fields with a transformer architecture, and this can actually achieve a new functionality, automatically locating flexible regions, as you can see in this left figure. So the methodology of our approach, with an input image like this is a picked particle 2D micrograph. Our pipeline first utilizes a pair of image encoders here to extract the features for its orientation and deformation. So the orientation features is then utilized to estimate the image pose of this image. And the deformation encoder encodes the conformational state of the cryo-EM image. So the final density volume would be conditioned on this deformation feature. Then our implicit neural spatial feature volume maps real domain 3D coordinates into a spatial feature. And to reduce computational cost, we follow instant NGP that uses hash encoding followed by a tiny MLP to extract spatial feature here. Then to estimate our final density volume, we design a query-based transformer decoder where the deformation of each of the 3D point, where the deformation feature and the spatial feature of each of the 3D coordinate interact here and mapped to a final density value. And specifically, we have a series of structure queries. Each of them correspond to a 3D region in the reconstruction space. So we are able to locate dynamic regions of our interest through analysis of this high-dimensional attention map. So these are for the visualization of attention map. And this is our experimental results on the ADS ribosome. Our approach achieved better recovery of details than conventional approaches like CryoSpark or previous neural field-based approaches like CryoDragon and SFBP. And on the right are the FSC curves. Our approach obtains highest curve, which stands for quantitatively best reconstruction. And we also demonstrate the function of highlighting moving regions. On the left is the PCA of the deformation feature. And if we sample along one of the axes, we can get different conformational states of the structure. And by coloring the volume with the different channels of 3D attention map, we are able to locate interesting dynamic regions like the helicase and the SF3B region of this speciesum. And yet there still exist open problems in heterogeneous cryo-EM reconstruction. The first one is motion versus orientation. It is still hard to disentangle them in 2D. And this can lead to ineffective image encoding in the current works, also in our work. And the other is simultaneously determination of pose and reconstruction. So current neural field-based approaches, including ours, still relies on pre-computed pose estimations. So to solve these bottlenecks, after CryoFormer, we have made several attempts to address these challenges. The first is CryoGEM. CryoGEM uses generative model to simulate the cryo-EM imaging, so we can produce high-quality annotated data for the tasks like particle picking and ab initio 3D reconstruction. And these are both important steps in the cryo-EM reconstruction pipeline. And here, the ab initio 3D reconstruction also involves pose estimation. So this somehow solves the first issue. And another work called Traco is the first cryo-EM foundation model, and it provides a general purpose feature extractor for cryo-EM images. And both works are accepted to this year's NeRFs. And that's it. Thank you for your attention. And our poster is over there. Feel free to talk to us soon. Thank you.
We have time for one question. If there's any question in the room.
You mentioned some ambiguity about pose and motion, camp pose and
Yes.
and the orientation. Did you consider using rotational equivalent representations to solve this?
Sorry, consider what?
Using rotational equivalent representations.
Oh, yes. We actually tried that some rotation equivalent representations, but currently we find that it doesn't make things better, and we still have to fall back to those conventional approaches, use like branch and bound searching approach to search the orientations. Yes.
Great. Let's thank the speaker again for the talk.
Thank you.
All right. Next, we'll welcome David Borts. David will be talking today about radar fields, frequency space neural scene representations for FMC.
Hey everyone, I'll be presenting a recent SIGGRAPH paper on 3D scene reconstruction from radar fields. A little background first. FMCW radar sensors send out hundreds of beams in all directions and collect waveforms in black from the reflections in blue. This gives us a frame with hundreds of waveforms. Typically, we'd apply a peak finding algorithm here to get out a point cloud, but these are very sparse and we're losing a lot of the rich information that's in the waveforms. So our motivating question was, can we use the waveforms themselves? Our answer is yes, introducing radar fields, a neural scene reconstruction method for radar sensors. We're able to accurately reconstruct dense, detailed 3D geometry in complex urban scenes. We can capture individual cars, signs, bollards, and structural elements, even if these occlude each other. And we do all of this by driving through one time with a single 2D radar sensor. Neural field representations have been very successful for optical modalities, but most radar reconstruction work has focused on 2D bird's eye view grid mapping, as shown on the right. These works are limited by their input data, sparse 2D range azimuth disks. So they're trapped in 2D and can't really resimulate. So radar fields is our approach to bridge this gap between radar reconstruction and optical reconstruction. FMCW radars emit a continuous wave called a chirp and modulate its frequency periodically with a sawtooth function in our case. Now imagine this chirp being transmitted, the beam diverges, hits two objects in the scene, and reflections come back to the sensor after some time. Talk to me after this talk if you want to know the precise details of our signal processing pipeline. I'm going to skip ahead for time reasons, but in essence, if you correlate these reflections with the transmitted signal in frequency space, you'll see peaks corresponding to locations in the scene where you had reflections from that first and second object. This waveform is a raw frequency space supervision signal. But how do we predict how strong these peaks should be? So we model the received power, our supervision signal, as a product of transmitted power and the gain of the radar antenna squared, all over the distance to the target from the sensor are squared, again, due to the inverse square law. Note that all the variables on the right-hand side are already known in advance, except for the radar cross-section. In radar sensing, the radar cross-section is essentially a measure of how easy an object is to detect with the radar. It's a complicated, entangled quantity, and it depends on object opacity, geometry, and materiality. This is what we're learning. And we do this by factorizing radar cross-section into its three constituent parts, and we learn these point-wise like conventional radiance field methods. So point occupancy, point reflectivity, and point directivity. We're going to couple the last two terms together in our model, though, as we don't currently have a way to disentangle them, so we're going to treat them as a single reflectance term. So we query 3D space with coordinates x, encoded and embedded into features, and then each radar field has two neural components, one for occupancy and one for reflectance. Both components get the features, but reflectance also gets encoded view direction. The two predicted components of radar cross-section can then be passed through our forward model that you just saw, so that we can supervise with the raw measurement. But how do we reconstruct a 3D scene if we're supervising with these 2D measurements? So in order to learn a 3D representation, we need to actually model the way a real radar would record a 2D scan from a 3D scene. So for each beam center, we consider the cone defined by its divergence and randomly sample additional points within this cone. So this cone of points is the input to our neural field. Once we get our model predictions out, we then integrate this cone along both azimuth and elevation directions to get a single predicted waveform for each beam. This is a weighted integration using our radar sensor's antenna gain profile to actually weight the samples based on their angle off of the beam center, with stronger weight on samples closer to the beam center, naturally, as the beam is focused. And to implement this in our model is very straightforward. All we have to do is add this weighted integration into our forward model, and we're good to go. And in practice, we also regularize the occupancy field component to improve geometric realism, imposing certain geometric priors, preventing artifacts like, for example, floating occupancy. You can talk to me more afterwards to learn about that. How do we train our model? We need data. So we had to build a custom sensor rig that we mount to the roof of a car with a custom built radar on board. So all of the results that you're about to see are going to be on data collected with this vehicle. So let's take a look. Here's an example of our 3D occupancy reconstructions alongside the actual RGB captures from the same scene. So if you look, we can resolve individual cars like this one on the right-hand side, structural elements like that curb and bush on the left-hand side, or these two bollards on the left that just passed. And keep in mind, a lot of these are occluded. If we look at the same scene from a bird's eye view perspective, take a step back, it's a lot more clear what's going on. We can make out individual cars being resolved on both sides of the road, as well as the smaller structures, which are bollards. And now we can see that these walls on the right-hand side, and then also on the left-hand side in the back, which were not really visible and occluded in the camera captures, are still resolved in our representation. And here's the same side by side on another scene. You'll again notice those like signs on the right-hand side, these structures and barriers on the left. Or for example, these cars that are coming up in the beginning and that retroreflective sign. I mean, keep in mind that objects are not going to be exactly the same size in our reconstruction as they might be in the camera, of course, because our radar measurements are low resolution, especially at further ranges from the sensor. And of course, there are retroreflectors in some of the scenes. Sure, these results might not look glamorous to someone who works on LiDAR or camera reconstructions, but keep in mind that this is done with a 2D radio frequency sensor. Again, here's that same scene, bird's eye view. It's a lot easier to tell that we're getting these walls behind the objects. You can see this whole row of cars here, and the smaller objects are dumpsters. Here's one more side by side. This scene's a little longer than the others in a less urban environment, but you can see that gap on the left-hand side where the bushes are breaking. And then you can see we quite nicely model this three-way intersection coming up with the bushes on the left, and as well as the cars that are parked on the right-hand side of this scene are also being resolved individually. For example, this one passing right here. But the unique strength of radar fields is that it's inherently robust to adverse weather conditions. Here's the camera data from one of the foggy sequences in our data set. When we try to reconstruct the scene from camera images only, we fail to converge using traditional NeRF methods, like NeRF-acto in this case. Of course, there are NeRF methods that model volumetric scattering, and they do perform a lot better. But due to the large wavelength of millimeter wave radar, radar fields does not meaningfully degrade in these conditions, and we don't have to explicitly model any kind of volumetric scattering to still reconstruct in these scenes. So on that scene you just saw, here's radar fields. You'll notice that even in the dense fog, it doesn't stop us from resolving any of the signs, bollards, or even small light poles in the scene, like that bollard on the left-hand side there, or this bike and sign on the left-hand side in the beginning, or those two objects, or these signs, or this tree coming up on the right. This is way more clear in this scene just due to the smaller, thinner objects if we look at a bird's eye view. Please note the scale bar on the bottom right, that's 10 meters. So we are able to reconstruct at rather large ranges, even in dense fog. So we can get this whole parking lot on the right-hand side here of the scene that wasn't even visible in the camera data. Or like this bus, which is that rectangle in the bottom left, these buildings, which are the larger structures, and these smaller structures that you're seeing that kind of look circular. These are lamps, signs, and bollards in the scene. Keep in mind that they look a little bit shorter than you might expect in camera data, but that's because, of course, our elevation resolution is limited, and so we're only visualizing a slice of the z-axis here. They would otherwise be taller. But to us, this is really exciting because we're able to take this sensor that usually just gives point clouds, sparse point clouds, and get out dense 3D reconstructions even in fog like this. So thanks for coming to my talk. Please check out our website where we've released the code and we'll soon be releasing our data set we used. We're very excited about this work and its potential applications. So we'll have a poster. Please come chat.
Thanks for the great talk, David. We'll welcome the next speaker up while we take a question from the audience.
Morning, my name is Magdalena Wysocki. I'm with the Chair for Computer-Aided Medical Procedures at the Technical University of Munich, where we study computer vision in the context of medicine. And in the research we do, we deal with different medical imaging modalities, and these modalities follow their own physics and imaging principles. In my today's talk, I focus on a special case of imaging using sound waves and how the principles behind ultrasound impact the way we think and model neural fields for sonography. So you are all used to this nice RGB imaging. You can recognize structures, localize objects, name them, and you can even probably name some people here. And you can even reconstruct 3D scene just by looking at the single image. But try to do this with the images in the middle, impossible, unless you received years of medical training. So to see what you see here, it's a B mode image, it's a brightness mode image, grayscale value. And just to give you impression what you observe here, the edges, the white edges are interfaces between different materials, in this case, biological tissue. Sorry. Yes, in this case, biological tissue. And this could be, for instance, interface between fat and muscle. And if it's very bright, it's a bone. And the texture given in the image, it's not a noise, it's scattering. And for us, it's very informative. So in our research, the main goal is to make the life of clinicians easy. And the goal of this research in particular is to make the sonographic acquisition protocols to relax it, because currently it requires expertise. And we know that image-based novel view synthesis can provide us already some tools to synthesize B-mode images after acquisition is done, because doctors are interested with standard planes, and these planes can be simply missed during acquisition. The method that we know for ultrasound, they ignore physics of ultrasound completely. They work on interpolation of the B-mode images, and this is a problem. So we want to provide methods that are physics-based and that allow us to simulate images or synthesize images exactly as if seen by ultrasound device. And why is it a problem? Because we consider ultrasound imaging to be highly anisotropic. It means that there are variations of visual features depending on the propagation of the sound wave, and this depends on the orientation and position of the probe. And moreover, we are working with the sparse view scenario because our views are limited both by the human body, but also by what's possible with ultrasound device in terms of acquisition angles. So we need to think how this image formation process behind ultrasound works to model neural fields. And first thing, we have to look into the image plane we work with, because in computer vision, we work with many different kinds of projections. For example, perspective projection here. And in ultrasound, we don't have projections, we have a cross-section, because the image plane intersects volume of interest exactly at the location of which we create image. And then we have to think that images are visualizations of measurements. So we need to think about what we actually measure using ultrasound. And what we measure is echo. And we need to think what are the sources of echoes. We send ultrasound beam towards the tissue, and then we are listening with time delay for echoes. And one source could be the intersection of the tissue, interfaces of the tissue, with different acoustic properties, and this is the reflection part. And the second source of echo could be small inhomogeneities in tissue structure, like wall of the cell, for example, and this causes scattering. And what we received with ultrasound probe is backscattering. This maybe you can find an analogy when you think about measuring underwater or measuring in the foggy environment. So you also have scattering there. And also you can also think about ultrasound as measuring in a very dense body of water. So we use this ray-based model for ultrasound in Ultra-NeRF and propose a forward model for ultrasound. And with this model, we are able to create synthetic images, B-mode images that are plausible. But when we look into the decomposition of these images into the parameters of the forward model, we see that we have degenerate solutions. And in this example, you have skin, muscle, and the bone. You would expect to observe something in this decomposition. But in this case, we see that scattering amplitude explains the whole image. What you would expect is that scattering and reflection is separated, but also that we see attenuation coming from the layer of skin and also the layer of muscle. So we look further into this. Oops. Yes, no. And we refine this model for ultrasound, and we are proposing it in beyond Ultra-NeRF. What we mean by refining it, we defined a minimum necessary vector needed to explain this major acoustic phenomena, namely attenuation, reflection, and backscattering. We call it sonographic neural reflection field ultrasound NeRF. And also we look into regularization of this field based on physical properties of biological media. Namely, we know that tissue is supposed to be locally smooth, but also because we are regressing physical acoustic properties, we know that they are somehow correlated. We embedded it in the general NeRF framework, so we map coordinates that are sampled along rays. I can explain in the poster how we define the rays to the properties, acoustic properties, reflection, attenuation, and scattering. What we do here differently, because our images are synthesized from top to bottom, so we need to know the whole propagation path. We collect intermediate maps, and these intermediate maps are input to the forward map for ultrasound that I will explain in the next slide. And then with this forward map, we are synthesizing a remote image. We embedded regularization terms in the optimization part of the network. For the local smoothness of tissue, we are using total variation, but we know that in case of this changes in acoustic properties, we expect actually this variation, so we're weighting it with reflection coefficient. And we also know that scattering plays a role in attenuation, so we expect the both maps to be correlated, and we are maximizing local normalized correlation between the two. So let's take a look at the forward map we are using. We separate echo into reflection and scattering part. Reflection depends on the transmitted wave and the reflection coefficient. We are amplifying weak reflections using log compression. And this is the standard thing, it's done in ultrasound devices. The backscattering also depends on the transmitted wave, but also scattering map, which is in our case, two-dimensional map of scatterers. And we define it by scattering amplitude and indicator function. And the transmitted wave finally depends on all preceding reflections and all preceding attenuation for any given point in space. We tested our method on 4 data sets that we created. We see that between Ultra-NeRF and ultrasound NeRF, in terms of quantitative metrics, we are on the same level. But when we look at the qualitative examples, we can see that in these green boxes, the structure is synthesized better for ultrasound NeRF. And also we can see the effect of, with the green arrows of bonds that create shadows. But improving synthesis was not our goal. In this paper, we wanted to have a meaningful neural field of acoustic properties. And when you see right now this example, remember the one that I presented before, you can observe that the scattering and reflection is separated as expected, but also we can observe the effect of attenuation coming from this layer of skin and muscle. In conclusion, in Beyond Ultra-NeRF, we are presenting the minimal neural field for ultrasound that limits possibility of degenerate solutions. We are also proposing physics-based regularization that enables this meaningful neural field acoustic properties. Outlook: in future, we plan to further improve this model to increase the physical accuracy and also, of course, to model motion and deformations. I'll be also at the poster. We can discuss more if you want.
Thanks for the talk. We have time for a question from the audience.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So a very basic question. So in real world, how would you do the camera calibration? So like how...
which camera? We do not have calibration.
No, not camera, but like how would you determine the position of...
The position,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So you want to know how we get the poses. So in real world, we are using for now a robotic arm to get the pose from the robot. So the robot, like we have events from the robot and the robot provides us the pose.
Ah, I see, makes sense. And the second one, I think you addressed it at the very end, but do you think that the deformations actually that are made by the ultrasound device would introduce a lot of non-rigidity in your scene, and this should be modeled?
Yes, it has to. If we want to bring it to real world application, we have to model the formation. It's the most important part right now, because the probe, when you press the body, basically it deforms. But for example, you can consider forces coming from the probe. If you are using a robotic arm, then it's even easier, because with which force you are applying the probe to the body, right? So
yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions.
Maybe we can start the talk. My pleasure to introduce Jon. Jon is a research scientist at Google DeepMind, SF, where he leads a small team that, from his website, mostly works on NeRF. He received a PhD in computer science from Berkeley, where he was advised by Xinhang Liu, and he received his bachelor's from University of Toronto in 2007. He received the national NSF GRFP, the CBR Multi Distinguished Research Award, and the PAMI Young Research Award, and has many awards from CV, PAMI, SCB, CBR. So yeah, Jon.
Hi. Thanks, everyone. Hi. Great to be here. I kind of want to make them simmer, but I don't know how. They'll figure it out. Hey, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about shiny things. I don't have any work on weird cameras, but shiny things are basically little cameras. So I figure that kind of works. So here's a NeRF. Here's like a really cartoonish sketch of a NeRF. It takes in, some neural network function approximator type thing. It takes in 3 inputs, X, Y, Z, location, space, and then 2 more inputs, which is how the viewing direction of the thing you're looking at. And I won't get into the rest of how this stuff works, but that viewing direction is kind of what I'm going to be digging into here. So you take this model, you wrap it in a ray tracer. You guys know how NeRF works. You're here. And this is kind of the state of the art where we're at in terms of like normal reconstruction. This is the task that me and my team work on the most. I want to just reconstruct this 3D environment from RGB images. And it works. We've come a long way with this technology. It works really well. This is actually my house. It's for sale now. If you want to buy a house in Alameda, California, let me know. So this reconstruction is actually really struggling in a few ways, one of which is specularities. Here's like a shiny counter and with some glass on it. You can see that this is kind of where the photorealism really starts to break down. The specularity is actually being dealt with pretty reasonably. What it's doing is it's making a mirror copy of the world of this backyard and that window box, and it's just hiding it underneath the counter at a long distance. And so it's a compelling illusion. It works fine when mirrors are planar. This is actually a totally reasonable thing to do. Video games used to do this all the time. They would make a mirror by just copying the world behind it, because the math works out perfectly. But this issue with specularities, shiny things, is actually like a really big problem, especially in scenes where there's curved shiny things, which are very common. So here's a car. The car is shiny on the windows and on the hood and everything. And not only is this car kind of being reconstructed somewhat poorly, you can see that the surface of the car kind of looks like it's bubbling and boiling and not quite right. But also you see these giant floaters floating in space. And what those are is the model failing to reason about view-dependent effects and just dumping stuff in front of a camera to explain away something it couldn't explain away otherwise. So this is where we're at now. This is a new paper that was just accepted to SIGGRAPH Asia. And we can do this now. We can reconstruct shiny things. So this is the paper. This will be in Tokyo, I think, in a few months, which is exciting. So let's dig into what's going on here. So here's a 3D reconstruction of like a normal NeRF model of a shiny object. Again, you see this kind of boiling, bubbling underneath the surface here, where it's struggling to model specularities. And the reason for this is that in a baseline NeRF model, where you're conditioning, the input is the viewing direction of a point in space. This is what the model has to learn. So for any point on this shiny ball, this animation to the right here is the thing that the neural network must memorize for any given point in space. And this is just a hard thing to learn, right? The world is mushing around and floating and wobbling in strange ways that are hard to predict. And you've tasked the neural network with memorizing this, and it struggles and fails. And the basic fix for this is that this parameterization is wrong. The parameterization you want to use is one where you take the surface normal of the object and you reflect the view direction along that, and you condition on the reflected direction. And if you do this, the mapping from a reflected direction to the outgoing radiance, to the light that would bounce off in that direction, is actually really easy if everything is infinitely far away. You're just basically memorizing an environment map, and if you do that, everything works fine. And this works for non-shiny things too. If you have a diffuse or semi-transparent, semi-shiny object like this brushed metal here, it still holds up. So this is what you get. This is from RefNeRF. This was a paper that we had about 2 years ago. This is what you get if you just do this reparameterization trick. So now you're not conditioning on viewing direction, you're conditioning on the reflected direction. That's what you see on the right. The shiny stuff looks shiny, the reflections are all moving around correctly. But this is still insufficient, right? Because I've assumed that the world is infinitely far away, and we can do better than this. So one reason why this is not great is that these reflection directions are somewhat insufficient. So here's one viewing direction that gets reflected into the reflected direction, and it's hitting that object. And now here's a different view of a very nearby object and a very similar, or the same reflection direction. And you can see that it's not hitting that object. It's skating on and hitting something else. So this is a problem for that RefNeRF model, right? Because these are two very similar inputs that have the exact same reflection direction, but very different outputs. And this is not what you want. And there's a problem in the opposite direction too, which is that these reflection directions can be wasteful. So here I have two points on a surface viewed from two similar cameras with very similar reflected directions. And they are, if you actually trace the rays, they're hitting the exact same spot in space. But the model under the hood has to memorize that there are two different positions with two different reflection directions that have the exact same color. That's hard for it. We're giving it a lot of extra work that it has to do. So the solution to this is actually, just actually do the kind of naive thing of casting reflection rays. So we're going to shoot a ray from the camera. It's going to bounce off the surface and go out into the world, and we're going to collect a few points along the ray. In practice, this is very hard to do computationally efficiently, but there's tricks for making it work. So we cast the ray, we get a few like alpha composited coordinates along this reflected ray. We average them together to get some sort of featurized version of that point in space, and then we decode that. To really make this work, you have to not just reason about rays, but reason about cones. And that's because not everything in the world is going to be a perfect mirror. So we have this kind of these conical reflections. This builds on work we have from MIPNeRF and ZipNeRF about how to reason about chunks of space instead of infinitesimally small rays. And the trick here is just you approximate this with multi-sampling. You have these kind of these patterns, these little 5-point patterns along these cones. Another trick for getting this to work is that the accuracy of your surface normals really, really matters, right? And this is a kind of subtle point that took me a while to understand. So here's the surface normals of this car when the car is diffuse, so it's not shiny at all. This looks fine by my eye, right? Like this, you look at this and you're like, yeah, it's a car, that's okay. But if you replace the materials of the car with a mirror, suddenly you see a lot of this weird kind of bumpiness that was very easy to ignore in the diffuse context, but when it's shiny, a very small perturbation of the normals will send your ray off in a totally different direction. And getting your normals perfect, like having the normals be very, very accurate, is a prerequisite for getting good reflections. If you have bad normals and you try to model everything correctly, you're giving your network a much harder job than it had previously, because it has to explain away these incorrect normals. So we have a solution for this in the paper, which I feel like is kind of a half solution. Basically, we have this asymmetric loss where we train a neural network to predict normals, and we have a stop gradient that kind of makes it asymmetric. I'm not going to get into this because I feel like there are probably better solutions out there that we haven't cracked yet. But this is, I think, an open problem of like how to regularize these normals to work well. I just want to put out there. So here's what the model looks like. This is a rendering from this car that I showed earlier. And I just want to highlight how kind of remarkable this is. You're seeing a lamppost and branches and stuff in the trees. Here, let's focus on this lamppost here. You can see the lamp on the hood of the car. That lamp is never observed in the input images. So at no point did the photographer tilt the camera up and take a picture of the trees or whatever. So the only supervision that we are getting of that lamp is through reflections. And like I said, we're actually bouncing rays off into the world. So that lamp does exist in the 3D model. It's not just like a memorized reflected effect. But I think this is so cool. Here's another car where our office is in San Francisco. So this is our main source of shiny objects. You can see really nice, there's a slight dent in the side of the car here, which I really like. So you can see, but you can see reflections of the the buildings and that cactus and everything. Here's another example. This is, again, a somewhat contrived scene that we set up to kind of look at these near field reflections. You can see the bowl and the painting on the ground is reflected. You can see out the window briefly, and that's an actual ray getting cast out the window. Here's a comparison against some other models. It's probably hard to see, but basically UniSCF is a precursor method that works pretty well, but it's lacking some detail, and we can sharpen that up. Here's another result there. This is probably best appreciated on the project page, which I should have linked here. So that was like kind of a baby step towards this bigger problem of inverse rendering. So in that NeRF casting paper, we're still just doing view synthesis. We just want new pictures of the same thing that we had previously. But we're starting to reason about how light and materials interact and how things bounce around. The goal we really want to build to is like a full inverse rendering system where we take in the input and we don't just allow ourselves to make new views, but we can get surface normal, albedo, material decompositions of the scene. And this enables relighting. That's the main kind of thing we play with because it's an easy thing to evaluate. But also, if you have a system that can do full inverse rendering, you unlock a lot of applications. You can retexture the object. You can estimate its materials in some sort of semantics context. You can do bump mapping, white balance, object insertion, all sorts of things. And the basic idea for inverse rendering is that you're going to set up a forward rendering process that is differentiable, and you're going to render your scene and compare it to a rendering and then minimize some loss. The math for forward rendering this is a well understood stuff. This is just a rendering equation. I don't know how much detail I should get into here, but the basic problem with forward rendering is that you have a lot of bounces. So you want to get the light coming into the camera from this point in space, and that means you need, for that point in space, to consider all the light that could come from all directions. And to do that, you need to cast new rays and hit new points, etc. So this is hard. This is a really hard problem. This just gets so expensive. Global illumination, if you want to reason about light bouncing off of things that then bounces off of other things that bounces off of other things, every time you bounce, you're raising, you've got this big O of n to the power of num bounces -1. It scales incredibly poorly. And just one of those bounces is actually really hard because you don't really know where the stuff is. You can't just bounce and then, well, you can approximate it, but ideally when you bounce off of something, you need to trace that ray and figure out where the stuff is because you don't know where it is yet. And volume rendering, as great as it is in terms of quality, it's slow. This is a real serious set of problems. So one piece of work we have in this direction, and this is, Ben just presented this poster session just now, this paper Flashcast. This will also be an oral on Friday. So please check that out for more detail. And yeah, so the basic idea here is that this path tracing problem is extremely expensive. You got to sample points along your first ray, you got to bounce them, sample points along the second ray, bounce them, this polynomial explosion that happens because everything becomes this recursive evaluation. And so the central idea here is that we're going to do this thing, we're going to do radiance caching, where we're going to do a single bounce approximation of the rendering equation. I'm so glad I brought water. So yeah, so this obviously solves the problem, right? Like this is, if you're doing a small amount of constant time work at each of these points, then you get rid of this whole polynomial explosion. But we have the NeRF, right? Like we don't need to do this. You can actually just get these secondary bounces by just actually rendering the rays from the NeRF that you have. The NeRF is basically a decent radiance cache. It's just very slow to evaluate. Here, this is a fun visualization that Ben would use that we all got used to looking at, where that red dot there is moving along the surface of the object. And on the right is an environment map rendering of what all the incident light looks like coming into that one point in space. So the basic idea here, and I'm going to gloss over all the details, is we're going to use ideas from control variates to basically learn a fast approximation to this in a way that reduces variance. I won't get into the math, but basically we're going to learn a little quick lookup, a little quick function approximator to this very difficult to evaluate thing. Find Ben after this if you want to know details. Here are some results against a precursor technique, a really nice work called TensoIR that we call Tensoir. I don't know if that's what they want us to call it, but Tensoir does a great job, but it's struggling to capture all the details here. So here we have albedo and relit results. You can see that Tensoir has this this relighting that, well, it has this albedo that captures a lot of the specularity on the rim of the plate that is actually not albedo, that's actually reflected light. These differences are subtle, but they can be visible in the relit image, where you can see when you relight this hot dog, the highlight that was incorrectly attributed to albedo persists in the relit image. More results, surface normals. We're getting nice surface normals out of this, getting nice albedos out of this, getting nice material roughness. It's hard to, these visualizations are funny. The hot dog, I think, is the clearest explanation of this, where the bun of the hot dog is very rough because it's made of bread, and the plate is very smooth. And you can see that, like, yes, we have correctly estimated that. These are results on real data. Getting results on real data here is really tricky. There aren't that many data sets. This is a nice data set that we used. And you can see the albedo of this little tin can correctly has the kind of painted on structure, and the normals are smooth, and the tensor baseline, again, has this problem of these bumpy normals that are explaining away some albedo effects as though they're shading and bumps. So yeah, and digging deeper into this inverse rendering problem, we have this paper. This was at CVPR this past summer. Dora's lead on this. This is Eclipse. This is, again, trying to do inverse rendering. And here we're digging really deep into a specific problem that we discovered that really actually is, I think, a big bottleneck for quality that we really wanted to solve. And the basic idea here is that we wanted to use these accidental shadows, or really we wanted to get rid of these accidental shadows. We had this recurring problem we would have in our captures, is that we would send a photographer out, or one of us would go out to take some pictures. And usually it was Peter Hedman, our lab mate. And we had this Peter problem, which is that Peter kept casting his own shadow into the scene. And you can see this here. This is someone just taking pictures of a table in our office. And there's the shadow of the photographer is coming into view every once in a while. And it's a really subtle effect, but it's significant enough that it can actually totally tank reconstruction. It can completely mess something up. And we're not the first people to notice that this is a problem. And in fact, other people have noticed that this is not just a problem, but it's also a cue. There's this really fun paper from CVPR 2012 by Antonio Torralba and Bill Freeman about these accidental pin spec cameras. The paper's full of these weird pictures of Antonio standing in front of a wall and jumping and making a little cannonball. And the basic idea here is that, I'll just quote, that a shadow is not just a dark region around an object. A shadow is the negative picture of the environment around the object producing it. So here, like this column on the right, they took a picture of the scene with no Antonio, and then he walks into the scene and jumps and makes a little cannonball and casts a shadow, and then they just diff the two images. And that's what you see in the bottom right. And you can see that you get this weird image of the environment around you. So that the ground, it's upside down, so it's a little funny, but the ground looks noticeably blue, and that's because you're actually getting a picture of the blue sky above you, and the wall looks kind of reddish because that's a reflection of the bricks around the MIT campus. So these little shadows are actually informative. They're not just a annoyance, but they are a source of signal. And so let's dig into exactly what this means. So here is a normal capture of an object. We used potatoes for this. These diffuse, boring-looking potatoes, because we wanted something that we could get easily from a grocery store that was very diffuse, and a potato was the easiest thing we thought of. I think the source code for this project is called potato. So you're going to see some potatoes. It's a little weird, sorry. So if you just capture some diffuse potatoes, they're diffuse. There's no shininess. There's very little signal here. And if you want to try to reconstruct the illumination of the environment that surrounds you, you're going to do a pretty poor job, probably about as poor as you all would do looking at this right now. So the true illumination, the true environment map is shown there in the bottom left. And if you try to just reconstruct that by just solving for it in an inverse rendering setting, you get pretty bad results. The model can kind of tell that the top is brighter than the bottom, and that's it. And I think that makes sense. You look at this now and you're like, yeah, I can't tell where I am. I could maybe believe that I'm outdoors and that maybe the top looks a little bluer than the bottom, but that's it. Now let's assume a more realistic capture setup where the camera has a person holding it. And that means that person is going to be blocking the light coming in from the environment map onto the object. Again, if you look at this, it actually looks the same. I don't think most people could really make much sense out of this. to my eye, these renderings look almost identical. You can kind of see some low frequency variation at times. But surprisingly, if you feed this same input to a model that tries to do inverse rendering, you can actually recover the environment map to an astonishingly high degree. Like you're seeing the actual shapes of the little buildings there and stuff like that. The details of why this works are a little funny. It's all just kind of boring linear algebra. So if someone gave you a bunch of images of a mirror potato, like a mirror ball, and said, I need you to write down the forward system of your imaging system, you would end up with this T by T matrix here in the upper left, which is a diagonal line. And then you can invert that system really straightforwardly because the eigenvalues are all flat. The matrix just inverts perfectly, and you can recover the environment map. And this is obvious, right? If someone gave you a picture of a mirror ball and said, recover the environment map, you would say, well, I already have it. I have a picture of this mirror ball that is a picture of the environment map. If someone gives you a picture of the same scene or a series of pictures of the same scene of these diffuse potatoes that have no specularity, you write down the system, you end up with this like really poorly behaved linear system with this eigenvalue spectrum that falls off really fast. And what that means is the system is not invertible. And the weird thing here is that if you just add shadows in, you end up with a linear system that looks very similar. It's not obviously different, but the eigenvalue spectrum of the linear system actually behaves pretty well. It's not as good as a mirror surface, but it doesn't fall off. It doesn't fall off to zero, and you can invert it. So this is all just linear algebra. Again, I wish I could go into details, but so here are some results. This is two shots of this object spinning around with and without occluders. You probably can't tell the difference. This is recovered illumination without the occluders and with the occluders, and there's the ground truth. This is synthetic results. Synthetic results work really well because we have like perfect alignment. On real data, it's worse, but you're still doing something pretty reasonable. So here is a reconstruction from, again, a very diffuse object, this Morton's salt thing that's just made of paper. If you try to reconstruct this without reasoning about occluders, you end up kind of discovering that the top is brighter than the bottom, which is generally true of most environments, but not much else. And if you throw in the occluders, suddenly you're not getting a perfect reconstruction, but you do recover the fact that there is light kind of in the horizon here, and it does understand that there are these lights overhead in the ceiling that are illuminating it. They're not in exactly the right spot, but I think it's pretty remarkable that it can do anything at all here, given that you or I looking at this can barely make sense of this. And that's it. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions? Maybe we can take one question. I'm sure we have time. No questions. I guess one question for me would be, what's kind of the next cue that you would want to use? Reflections, shadows, how else can we kind of get more information about the environment?
I think invisible light, I think we're kind of running out. Is there something you have in mind?
No, I'm just wondering, I mean, you can only see RGB, maybe there are other wavelengths or time of flight or conventional cameras.
I think there's no shortage of things you could do with different kinds of sensors to integrate into these models. It's honestly, I mean, I'm delighted to be here and to talk to people who work in the space more, because I don't really have a good sense of all this stuff. And Google's perspective for a lot of this is, Google makes hardware that a billion people buy, and RGB cameras are like the most ubiquitous thing. And other sensors on top of that are like less a lower priority for us. If this community could kind of consolidate around a small, cheap sensor that you could imagine being on commodity hardware for a billion people, then it would be a thing we would definitely want to use. I think that hasn't quite emerged yet, but well, I don't know. You will tell me.
Thank you. Thanks, Jon Barron.
Thanks again, John. Very inspiring talk.
Very cool.
I'll present our first speaker, Vondrick.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you, Mark, for the very nice intro. Sorry for the laptop troubles. I'm actually going to pick up on the last question, which was about how can you use reflections, maybe reflections that you can't see. Okay. Yeah, this is a typical just RGB picture you can get. This is a photo taken in a closet at Columbia, New York. Not that interesting a photo, to be honest. But one of the problems that we try to solve in computer vision often is to do 3D reconstruction. How can you reconstruct the scene? And it's a really hard problem from just a single photograph, right? It's an under-constrained problem just to reconstruct this scene from a single photograph. We don't know if are the cups painted on the wall or are they actually there, creating some sort of non-trivial geometry there. So what we've been looking at, maybe 2 years ago or now 1 year ago now, looking at this problem of how can we actually reconstruct the world using non-visible light as well. So this is the same scene you just saw before, but now looking under a thermal camera. And what do you all see here in this video? What's going on in this video here? You guys are experts on non-visible light. What do you see here? Take a guess. Okay, yeah, it's someone lifting their arms, right? What you're actually looking at is the infrared reflection of a student that working on this project lifting his arms up and down. And so what's happening is all of these objects, which are normally not mirrors to our eyes, have turned into mirrors under infrared. And so what we want to do is use those reflections to not only reconstruct the scene, but also reconstruct the person, even though they're not visible to a normal camera. So here's the actual scene, and this was actually done by Roshi, a PhD student at Columbia. That's the only appropriate use for the flame animation. Yeah. Okay, so the basic principle at play here is basically black body radiation, which is people know about black body radiation. This is the idea that everything actually creates light. It's just the color or the wavelength that light depends on the temperature, right? So the sun is, for example, very, very hot. So that creates light that our eyes can see, but you yourselves are actually also very hot inside this room, and so you are also creating light. That chair over there is creating light. So everything around us, as long as it's not 0 degrees Kelvin, is actually emitting light, and so we're all light bulbs. And what thermal cameras are a special type of camera that are designed to capture basically certain wavelengths that usually correspond to the temperatures that our body produces, right? In most environments, we are actually the hottest object in rooms. So we actually are a light bulb to thermal cameras, right? We are a light source for thermal cameras. So this is very interesting. Black body radiation is super interesting on the physics. It's basically a precursor to quantum mechanics. Very fun topic to read about. This is a thermal camera that we were using throughout this project. It's a $7,000 thermal camera that you can buy. So it's not quite cheap enough for Google to put it on all of their phones yet. So thermal cameras are often used by the military because they let you see at night, right? If you want to spot a person at night, which is a very important thing for someone in the army to do, thermal cameras are fantastic, right? Because if you turn on the lights, we are light sources. We are actually creating light, right? Thermal cameras are often used in kind of a bunch of engineering applications because there's a way to figure out the temperature of an object. It's not a perfect mapping to recover this temperature from infrared light, but there is kind of some approximations for it. And so when you go read about thermal cameras, they tell you they can try to recover the temperature. There's a really interesting disclaimer on all thermal cameras, basically telling you that it's not always accurate. The temperature that it reads is not always accurate. That's because thermal cameras don't actually measure temperature. They're just measuring infrared light, and you can try to predict the temperature from the infrared light. And so what you're looking at here is Roshi again jumping in front of the window in our lab. But glass turns into a mirror for infrared light. So even though we can't see, we basically see through glass, right? For infrared light, it actually reflects off of it. It's a really great mirror. And so we kind of live in this, in the world of infrared, we live in this really weird world where a lot of things in our environment are actually just mirrors, right? And we are the light source. Whiteboards turn into mirrors. They're actually great mirrors. So here's just the view from a thermal camera. Cars are actually fantastic mirrors. You know, I guess in normal light they are almost mirrors as well, but they're great mirrors in infrared. So this is a pretty complex mirror, right? The geometry on the car is pretty complex. Bowls, right? A lot of ceramics turn into mirrors for infrared as well. And the elevators, right? That you gotta look at the elevator over there, right? That's actually a great mirror in infrared. So the problem we want to solve is how can we reconstruct? What is the 3D world that would have created a certain reflection, right? And this is actually, if you think about it, it's actually kind of a hard problem, especially in today's AI landscape, because there's no internet of thermal data around, right? We have all these great diffusion models and so on that are working on normal pictures, but where do you get a big training set for all this thermal data? So how can you solve this problem kind of with your standard deep learning toolbox today? So we're going to approach this from a slightly different angle, which is we're going to write down the forward process for how this reflection, how this image could have been generated, and then we're going to invert that process in order to recover what are the 3D worlds that could have created that image, right? And the way this image was created is, you know, conceptually quite simple. Is that there's a person, which is the light source. Light is emitting from that person, reflecting about a mirror, right? And then it's arriving at a camera, right? And so we can write down with generative models and integrating the how light moves in this scene to basically generate this type of scene. And then we can run this whole model backwards to figure out where is the person, what is their pose. And this is pretty good. This is actually today. This is, you know, we have great generative models, right? Gen AI has given us these great models for generative models over 3D humans in time, as well as 3D objects and images. So we can integrate a little bit of the physics into these models. We actually can do some really cool things without needing to go collect a big training set. Right. Oops. Okay, we have to watch the animation. Sorry. So basically, the problem that we want to be solving is that we're given an image X that we observe, and we're going to write down the forward process, which is this RGC terms there. And then we're going to be solving this optimization problem, saying what is the latent variables for these generative models, such that when you do ray tracing from one object reflecting about the other, arriving at the camera, you get an image that is very consistent with what you've observed. Okay, so as John said, it's really important to get these normals correct, right? If you get the normals wrong, this does not work. So we spent a lot of time in this project actually trying to refine how well we could estimate the normals on these mirrors, right? If you're slightly off, this whole thing is going to fall apart. So I mean, I guess I'll defer to the paper for all the little details that go into getting this normal representation to work. We found some really interesting kind of adversarial examples inside a lot of SDFs that make this hard. But the basic idea is that we're going to do sphere tracing for this to find that point and estimate that normal so we can reflect about it. Okay, so when we submitted this paper, we originally submitted this paper only inside Columbia at that room you saw at the very beginning. And all the reviewers at CVPR came back and said, this is cool, but what's the application? And so this was the most intense rebuttal we've ever done. We rented cars, drove him out into the suburbs. This is in the 1 week period of rebuttal, and recorded all of these experiments. And this was all doable though, because there's no training here, right? You don't have to go collect the training set, right? All we had to do was go collect a couple of testing examples, right? And it worked. So here's just a typical RGB image of one of the cars we rented. Here's the same scene under a thermal camera and the reconstruction that we can get of both the car and the person, right? Even though they're not visible to the normal camera here. So this is Roshi, and this is all the rebuttal. So we're trying to be anonymous. He's wearing a hat, you know, to hide his identity, and that's his roommate, I believe, there, who's helping him come out. So we, you know, I think the results are pretty cool because you know, the geometry on this car is it's not just a flat mirror, right? So it does a pretty good job at estimating that normal and actually be able to reconstruct. So this potentially could be useful for you know, cars to see around corners and avoid pedestrians. Self-driving cars won't hit a person because they actually are driving around with a bunch of mirrors and can better see pedestrians. Here's another car that they rented. We can only afford 2 cars, so we rented 2 cars. Here's Roshi jumping again and making some fun poses in front of the car. And here's the reconstruction that we're able to get. So pretty good, right? Like you can see the hands are like, it gets one of the hands almost right, the other hand is wrong, right? I mean, this is still a severely under-constrained problem because you only have one thermal camera. So a lot of this is basically relying, I think on some ways I think this is quite interesting because it's relying on the evidence that you observe. It's relying on the priors that these generative models have learned about human pose, right? And using a little bit of the physics, right? To combine those two. So this pose is kind of outside of the prior of the generative model. So I think that's why it puts the other hand right here, kind of there instead. Yeah, but anyways, it works in a lot of different cases. It's really, if you ever have a chance to, you can buy kind of a cheap thermal camera off of Amazon. It's not that great, but at least it lets you play around with it. So you couldn't do these results with a cheap thermal camera. But it's just fun to see all the different types of things that turn into mirrors. Oh, there we go. We can get him sitting down. We can't get the chair, but we can get Roshi's pose correct here. Okay, how much time I got? I got 10 more minutes or 5 minutes? 10 minutes, yeah. Okay. So yeah, we've been really interested in basically, you know, I think we've been really interested in how these generative models that are trained on the internet on so much data actually provide really good priors that let us better interface with the physical world. And we saw that with the thermal cameras here, where it's hard to collect to train data of thermal images. But if we know a little bit of structure about the problem, we actually can reuse these generative models trained on the internet for these different purposes. So we've been thinking a lot about this in these types of terms, where there's just massive amounts of visual data that we can get, but the amount of physical data you often can get is very, very small. So this is especially true in a robotics case. This is a video from Stanford of the mobile Aloha from Chelsea Finn's group. And these results are incredible if you haven't seen this. This is a robot doing imitation learning to solve different tasks. And one of the key results they show off here is actually the ability to do some extrapolation, right? So I think it was, yeah, so this system was trained to only push in the first three chairs, and then it could automatically extrapolate to the next two chairs, right? So I think in robotics, this is huge, right? This is a really big advance. But if you look at what generalization means in kind of a computer vision or machine learning context, we want much more generalization than that, right? You want this to be able to learn on these types of chairs and then go push in those chairs here. Right? It's a very extreme amount of generalization. And the reason why it's so hard to get that type of generalization is because it's basically only able to train on the small amount of data, right? It's only able to train on the small physical amount of data that you have. And we want to achieve a generalization by leveraging all this visual data that we have. So is there a way that we can use these generative models, not only do 3D construction from potentially, non-invisible light, but also be able to better interface with the physical world and do robotics with this, where you're always going to be limited amount of physical data that you can obtain. So this is a Coral paper that was just accepted that was looking at this problem, which is trying to solve robotic tasks by leveraging a lot of these generative models are trained on the internet, and how can we transfer them to actually do interaction with the world. So here's a typical kind of a simple scene. For robotics, it's actually a little bit more complex just because the number of distractors that are there. And we all here can sit and imagine, like, what would it look like if a person were to pick up a spoon and try to scoop something into the bowl? So a generative model can do this quite well, but how do you actually transfer this to a robot? How do you get a robot to do exactly the same task where it can actually pick up the spoon and then go do the scooping? So, it's incredible what all is going on in video generation. I started working in video generation doing my PhD a while ago, and the results were really creepy back then. Nowadays, it's incredible what they can do. This is one of my favorite videos from Sora. I like this video a lot because not only is it very pretty and looks really cool, but the failures it has are really interesting and subtle. So it's not always reliable, right? If you look at the cars behind the trees here, they disappear all of a sudden. If you look very carefully, these models are so good at creating something compelling, but they often get the little details wrong. And this is really bad when you want to interface with the real world, right? Because the real world keeps you honest, and you have to get everything correct for it to play out in the real world there. And they're not always reliable, right? Especially in the case in robotics, if you try to like use these video generations on these types of models, they don't fully understand that can't happen, right? They don't really understand everything about kind of how the constraints of the real world. Another problem with doing all of this is there's this big gap between the bodies, right? In robotics, people have been working hard to build a hand that is very close to the human hand, but it's still not quite right there, right? There's this embodiment gap between them, between human demonstrations and what robots can do. So how do you actually bridge that gap? So what we looked at here is, we want to use all these priors that generative models have learned. They seem pretty good at actually being able to tell you how to solve this task, but how do you transfer it to a robot, right? And the thinking is that the generative model can do generalization. Given a new scene, it can do a pretty good job at actually doing some generalization, but how do you align that with a robot? And so what we did in this Coral paper is just took a couple different tools, and we could 3D print and design these tools, both a human counterpart and a robot counterpart for the tool. And we demonstrate a couple of actions. I think it was like 100 different demonstrations, very small amount of these tools, of doing different tasks with those tools. And you just fine tune this generative model on these tools. And what you can then do is, given an entirely new scene, you can generate, right, how a person would have solved that problem with these video generators. You can track those tools, and then just have a robot execute exactly what to imitate the state of that tool. So we call this dream imitate, because you dream and then you imitate what you dream. And what we found is that actually this worked incredibly well for generalization. So if you trained on some objects, it actually can generalize very well to a completely different set of objects that are very different, that's never seen before. So here's, for example, in scooping, here's the video that it generates on the top of how a person would solve this task. And then we can imitate that very well here. And it's never seen this type of configuration. It's a very extreme amount of generalization here. It's never seen this exact material, that type of bowl, and this type of configuration here. Here's more examples. For scooping, this top is what is generated by the model, and the bottom is our ability to imitate that. So it works in all these different cases. A really simple example, I think, is actually pretty hard for a lot of systems, is even just like rotating an object. So it's never seen the task is basically rotate an object 45 degrees. Very simple thing, very easy for us to do, very hard for robots to still do, because you have to get the contact points exactly right. So here the system has never seen a banana being rotated. It's seen other things being rotated, but not the banana. So the generative model here actually has really good priors about how a person might rotate a banana. And then we can have a robot imitate it's the same task here. Works on long horizon tasks too. Here the goal is basically push this object into a goal state where you got to do it many different times. And so it's never seen a 4. It's been trained to push A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but it's never seen numbers. So it actually does a pretty good job at matching this pretty close. Here's another example for 7. So you just want to skip over here and running out of time. So basically the results are I think pretty interesting on this, which is showing that using the priors from these generative models, your generalization can be really good, right? If you just use only the physical data that you can collect, that's the blue curve here, your performance, goes towards 0 as your amount of demonstration data you collect goes down. But with the generative model, you actually get great generalization, right? You're able to collect much smaller amount of data to obtain the same performance. So it doesn't always work. Here it hallucinates 3 hands to try to solve the problem. So these models are not perfect. They don't know everything about the world. But I think that's a really promising direction to basically bridge, if you have a little bit of physical insight into how your problem works, you can use what's happening during the models to have great priors in order to solve these problems. Okay, so happy to take questions.
Thanks, Carl. These were some very impressive results. Anybody wants to ask a question?
Thanks for the talk. In the last part of the talk, you do imitation learning from the robot. Is it from just 2D videos generated from the generative AI, or is there any other modalities like that? Or
yeah, that's a fantastic question. We actually so the input does have depth, and what we do is we generate stereo video. So what's going on is, given the scene, we want to imitate exactly what the person has done, and so depth is very important there. So we have a generative model basically that pretends to be a stereo rig, which allows us to do tracking in 3D in what the videos that are created. And we were worried about this because, right, it could generate stereo views that are not consistent with each other, but empirically it seems to do a great job. So we kind of live in this. We live inside this dream here.
Thanks for the next talk. So about the first part.
Yeah.
So you are saying that the thermal light and the normal light are actually the same, right? So, so I mean, there's a main difference between, I guess, the wavelengths. What is much, the thermal light, the wavelength is much longer or shorter, or
yeah,
vice
right.
versa.
Yeah,
So does that cause any difference, like when we do the reflectors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so at the end of the day, light is light, so it all behaves by the same rules. Basically, yeah, the wavelength changes. It changes what becomes a mirror. So yeah, this is what goes on basically, because the material properties of each object are different. Depending on what the wavelength of light, it's going to become a mirror or not. So really, the physics doesn't change, but our intuitive physics changes quite a lot.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Hi, thanks for inviting me and for the introduction. Happy to be here. I'll present our paper from CVPR 23, see-through NeRF neural radiance fields in scattering media. So the first author of this paper, Dvora, is here. So when you have difficult questions, she's the address for that. Yeah. So as you see, we developed NeRFs to work underwater. Before I explain what we did, a couple of slides for motivation. So 70% of the Earth's surface is water. And besides surfing, it also, the ocean itself has a lot of implications on our lives, oxygen, climate change, and so on. So it's also important to research this environment. So what happens when you take NeRFs underwater? On the left, you see images from different viewpoints. We acquired, actually my PhD student, Matan, acquired while diving. And we plug them into MIP-NeRF. And what you see is that the NeRF actually produces kind of a blue veil on the scene because it doesn't model the water, it doesn't model the medium. So it tries to explain, like in the case of reflections or things you saw previously, it tries to explain the blue color by a blue object in the scene and doesn't actually model the medium. And what happens underwater, that appearance changes with distance, water attenuates and scatters the light. So if you just take a peek on the images that we took from different viewpoints, they are different. The colors of the same object are different in them because the different viewpoints change the distance between the camera and the object. So this is one of our results. I'll show that and then I'll explain what I did. Matan was very committed to science, flew to Curacao to take some pictures. And so these are the input images. And you can appreciate the changing illumination, and this is our result. And you'll see soon the comparison side by side with the original NeRF that you saw before. So all the curtain effects are not there, and we are able to reconstruct all the objects from the different viewpoints. What we really liked about that is that the NeRF helps us model the environment. So we can actually render the scenes without the water. And this is what a main goal of the lab for years is to remove the waters from the underwater images. So the NeRF actually helps us do that and recover the objects in the back. And also note that in all the scenes I'll show, there are complex scenes. We deliberately took scenes that have complex 3D structure, objects that are far away, because then you really can see all the effects of the environment. When you acquire images underwater from nearby, they're more beautiful, right? Because you have less water effects, everything is colorful, but to test computer vision on them, it's easier. So we deliberately picked complex scenes. Okay, so as I said, and that's actually a repeating theme throughout the day, is that the NeRFs help us model the medium. Might I have this thing? Okay. And what we want to do is to use it not only to model the objects, but also to model the environment, and then we can play with it and remove it. So the contributions are to insert the medium into the rendering equation. We added a medium model in the architecture. We did a few non-trivial modeling decisions, and we released 4 raw scenes. So these are linear scenes, sets of underwater scenes. So there are linear images, and this, then we can work on the physical model. So just a brief recap: when you image an object through water, the object itself attenuates with distance. And there is also backscatter. So backscatter is used in different modalities slightly differently. Here, there is a light that is scattered by the medium towards the camera. So this is an additive component that veils the object and increases with distance. Note that Daria and I published a few years ago in CVPR a revised image formation model, and we're using that. I'll take a minute to explain it because I think I like it. So usually if you saw works on haze, people use the equations on the top. You have a direct component, you have the additive backscatter, and they are governed by the same attenuation coefficients. What we showed that underwater, that attenuation coefficients are different for the direct signal and the backscatter, and actually they're also not uniform in the scene, so they depend on different things, and I'll explain why. It's not that the water changes, the medium doesn't change, right? So the physical attenuation coefficient is the same. What changes is how it affects the computer vision equations. Because in computer vision, we work in wideband RGB channels and not in the wavelength domain. So the physics, everything holds in the wavelength domain. But when you take an RGB image, what happens in the sensor is an integral over the wavelengths, right? So then all the reflectance and attenuation and all that, all of them are integrated over the wavelengths. Now, what we're trying to do, or what the Haze model does in RGB in wideband channels, is to take the exponent outside the integral, and all of you know that's not true. That can be done only if the coefficient is more or less uniform with wavelengths. This is more or less true in haze, but it's really wrong underwater. So that is not true mathematically, and doing that is an assumption that creates errors. That's why we modeled the coefficients to be different, although it's the same water, right? But the way they affect the RGB image is different. Okay, so how did we use that in NeRF? So the left side, all of you know. When you take look at the derivation of the NeRF equations and plug there in every point, you have a sigma for the object, so a density of the object, but you now also know that there is a medium. So you plug also a medium. We have these derivations in the appendix of the paper. You get something that looks like that. So every point has a combination of the medium and the object. We did a few assumptions that are true for the water to simplify the equations and to be able to use also less images. All the scenes have 20 images, which is not a lot for recovering more unknowns. So the assumptions are that the object is opaque, so there is one object along the ray. They're not like parts of objects along the ray. And the medium is semi-transparent with a low zero density. And as I said, the densities, we model them as a different density, and I'll show in the ablation that it's important. And the densities are continuous and uniform along each ray. We didn't stop them at the object. It's easier mathematically, although where there is an object, there is no medium, but then in the optimization that sorts out. And we let the densities change per ray because, as I said, how they affect the equations change with illumination directions and all that. So although the medium itself is uniform, how the densities affect the rendering of the images is not uniform across different viewpoints. And so that's easier assumption than what other computer vision methods assume, like a single attenuation coefficient per image. Okay, so then when you put all that, you get these nice equations that are pretty similar to the ones without the medium. They're almost symmetric. We add, so in each point there is a color contribution from the object and from the medium. And as I said, note that we use different densities to explain the medium in the two components for the object and the medium. This is the basic structure of NeRFs. We added a pretty simple MLP to estimate the extra densities of the medium and the color of the medium. Of course, we have the rendering loss, and we also used a loss that was suggested in LOL NeRF that forces the weights to be either 0 or 1 for the object to enforce the assumption that there is one single opaque object along each ray. So what can we do with this model? So as I showed you, we can synthesize novel views underwater by estimating everything and then rendering everything. We can also render the scene without the water. So we use only the object component and also remove the attenuation component. So zeroize the density component of the medium. And we can also render the medium, the backscatter. So only use that. And this is another scene. This is actually from the Red Sea in Israel. Nice corals, and as you see, a complex scene with objects that are far away. The far away objects are blue. It's difficult to see them. And that's our novel views. Compared to the original implementation that shows you a blue curtain. And this is the same scene rendered without water. So it appears black. It may be not natural because when you think about underwater scenes, you imagine blue. But we want to see what's behind the blue. So it's dark. The background is black, but you see the objects and their colors. And a few zoomings on the further objects. This is something that we're obsessed with in the lab. We want to see the far objects and we want to see the details. So if you look at, this is from the training set from a target image, you see this coral in the back where we were able to reconstruct the details, and MIP 360 couldn't reconstruct it, although that's not a novel view, it's a target view, but it wasn't able to model the scene even for, even for the target views. That's another one, that's a novel view, and then a coral that is further away, and you can see that we can render its details. Now an ablation, hopefully I'm not the only one who's interested by that, but we always ablate the revised model to show why you need more parameters. So we ran with 6 parameters, which is our model, because we have 3 for each attenuation coefficient. We did 1, which is just a monochrome attenuation for all for both object and medium, and 3 is a color attenuation for both. So actually for the 3, it's pretty clear to see that things disappeared, the far corals disappeared. And usually the effect of that is on the far corals, because then the difference between the attenuations is larger. With the 1 parameter, note that actually the 1 coral on the back is pretty nice, but the area in the front is kind of milky. So that wasn't modeled correctly. Another example, here in the pink area, we have a coral that disappeared in the 1 parameter, and a few other examples, also milkiness in the front. Okay, so there is an implementation of our paper in NeRF Studio, and it's better than our implementation. So I was allowed to say that. They did some better sampling, and Vora actually worked with them. So their implementation has less artifacts and less floaters, and you're welcome to try it. Now I left a few minutes for self-promotion. Fine. Tomorrow we have a poster that is not about NeRFs, but it is about underwater restoration by Ofer, who is here. So that's in the afternoon session. We do restoration with a single image. And I wanted to show you also a movie to show you how, like, the NeRFs are a nice theoretical work, but what are we actually trying to do in the underwater work? So you previously saw some robots that try to manipulate objects. I'll show you an underwater autonomous vehicle we are developing, and we are aiming to enable it to use vision underwater to avoid obstacles. And as you saw, vision underwater is difficult. You don't see well, especially further away. So cameras are not usually used as sensors for robots. People use sonars and so on. We mounted a forward-looking camera on this robot. This is what you see in the yellow part is the front part of it's called an AUV, Autonomous Underwater Vehicle. And this is the team preparing to launch it underwater. You see a cable with a buoy connected to it. We are not controlling it from above water. That's a debugging buoy to make sure it doesn't get stuck or drown or something else. So we see the images through the buoy, but the operation is autonomous. And here we gave it a simple task of don't get stuck in the pillars of the pier, which seems, you see that we put it in the water next to an artificial pier of the, it's not the electrical, the oil company. And we instructed the vehicle to go to a point which is past the pier. So these are initial results, and you'll see that the vehicle is able to pass the columns of the pier from the right, from the left, I don't remember. So it's looking at it, you see a view. We also have a forward-looking sonar and a forward-looking camera here, and it's using both to reconstruct the world 3D map in real time and avoid hitting the columns. Now, I know in computer vision conferences, people here already rode autonomous taxis in San Francisco and all that. So avoiding a column is maybe looks easy, but it's not easy underwater. Usually autonomous vehicles don't go through vertical obstacles. They're just float above and survey everything from above. You don't see vehicles doing these vertical surveys and so on. So for us, we're happy and excited to see that. Yeah, and while you see the end of the movie, I'm ready for questions. Or maybe the ball is ready for questions. No.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. Any questions from the room?
So what's the question? So how do we remove the water from the NeRF model?
So in the network, we have a model that estimates separately the object, the density and the color of the object, and the density of the medium. So then we can render using only the object. So we zeroize all the medium coefficients that we estimated and just render using the density and color of the object.
Super cool work. I guess I have two questions. One of them is, could you maybe talk about the trade-off between using sonar versus images? And the second question is on kind of the rendering equation of separating the attenuation and backscatter. Do you think that helps with like material estimation because now you have those components separated and so on?
So the first question was about the trade-offs between the sonar and the images. Yeah, so that's not about NeRFs, but in general, in the forward-looking sonar, we don't have it. You get like a top view, like a bird eye. So you get the z-axis and, oh, sorry, the lateral axis. You don't get the height, but it doesn't have visibility issues. So light penetrates and you see very far away, much lower resolution. The sensor is much larger, more expensive, takes more energy. RGB cameras, can be very small, but the main problem underwater is the visibility. And the second question was?
So I guess I was trying to understand more the rendering equation of separation of the attenuation and the backscatter component. Does that help with like material estimation because those kind of two separated? Is that?
Yeah, so there is a duality between the two components. One decreases with distance and one increases with distance. So it depends in various methods. You can, if you estimate both, they can actually help each other because you need to use the same distance estimation for both.
Great. Any other questions?
What was the most challenging thing that you found?
Sorry?
What was the most challenging thing that you found in this project? It's like challenge.
Yeah, there is a student here who hasn't slept for 3 months before the deadline, but maybe a stupid challenge, but a challenge thing was to find scenes data, which I mean, we had to get good scenes, raw images, and so on with different viewpoints. The second thing I think in the back, and this is always the problem underwater, the signal is very low, it starts to be noisy, and that's actually an advantage of using NeRFs because it was shown they have denoising properties. But when you try to look at the far points and then separate the medium from the object, and the signal of the object itself is low, then we had a lot of, so the front part, it's easy to reconstruct. But the back corals, they were disappearing and things until we found the right sampling, the right optimization, and so on to get us to like the further objects. Do you want to add it? No.
One more question on this slide. Actually, how difficult it is underwater shuffling motion, basically to pose the image areas.
Can you repeat that?
How difficult is shuffling motion in underwater?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question was how difficult is structure for motion underwater? So again, one of the things is the visibility. So at some point things fall. And we have actually a comparison between structure for motion on these scenes and the NeRF, and the NeRF was able to reconstruct further objects.
Awesome. Thanks so much
Thanks
for
a
a
lot.
great talk, and let's give Tali a round of applause. All right, so next we will have our panel discussion. The panel consists of, again, Tali, Jon Barron, and David Lindell, and will be moderated by Lindy. So just give us a couple minutes to set that up.